All right, ladies and gentlemen, this one's going to be a little bit longer. Why? Because, well, I have to preview two games and, of course, want to give you some background on what's been going on in the past couple of days in this third installment, or I guess you can say third, quote unquote. So Thursday, Copa America begins again, and we start looking at two interesting matches. The first one being Colombia-Venezuela. In these types of encounters, well, anything can happen. I mean, you can say it's a rivalry. You can say it's because of geographical reasons. There is a rivalry. Venezuela's given Colombia a hard time in Copa America. They've given Colombia a hard time the last 20 years, although in the last few encounters, Colombia's had the upper hand. That doesn't mean that will continue, although if you start looking at the way that these two teams have been going, they've been going in two opposite directions. They have. If you look at their recent form, especially under Reinaldo Rueda, where Colombia are unbeaten, they've been able to win 2 out of their last 3. And meanwhile, Venezuela's had all sorts of trouble. And a team that, as I mentioned, and you can listen in previous editions of this recent editions of this podcast, that I talked about the issues that Venezuela have in terms of setting up a team. They might have a little bit more leeway as players start coming back slowly but surely, but that of course is very doubtful, especially in the group stage when you've had players that were just they were recently given positives for COVID, and of course they just don't from one moment to the next come through and all of a sudden everything's fine. It could happen. I mean, it's not something that is not out of the ordinary, but it's not something that's very common, let's say. Colombia coming in with a great deal of good form, good defensive form. You start seeing their defensive blocks already beginning to form themselves once again. And Venezuela, of course, as I mentioned, a team that would basically be coming in shorthanded. Like I said, maybe not as shorthanded as they were against Brazil, but still, if there's one thing to really mention about Venezuela, is that despite them being shorthanded and not having some of the players that are capable of being difference makers or players that can then cause problems offensively, they were able to compete against Brazil. They were able to show some mettle, some personality, and be able to fight and give Brazil a hard time, or a hard enough time, although Brazil was just much better. But it took a while for them to be able to crack that defense open. Let's be honest. I mean, if you look at the match itself, it took Brazil a long time to break down Venezuela. But once they did, it was pretty much over. Colombia might be the same case. We might see some changes in the lineup. We might see Duvan Zapata and Muriel starting. We'll have to see how the lineup, of course, I'm talking about, just in a few hours' time, that's when the talk really starts brewing in terms of how this Colombian side will play. So it'll be interesting to see, and it'll also be a very interesting factor in the coming hours to see how they line up. And basically, if you ask me, it'll pretty much be something similar. I'm not sure if Borré will be in the starting 11. Like I said, probably Duvan Zapata will get the start, and we'll take it from there. Right? Again, with Borré, there's also some issues. I mean, I'm not saying that he's bad. I'm not saying, of course, he's an excellent player. His mind is not just on Copa America right now. There were rumors of him eminently leaving River Plate. He wants to go to Europe. He's rejected offers. I mean, the reason why I say this is because of the offers that he received an offer recently from Cagliari, and there's a chance he could leave. We have to see. He wants to go play in Europe. He's rejected offers from Grêmio, from Palmeiras, from Toronto FC, from teams in this end of the world, because his objective is to go to Europe. He wants to go back. He feels like there's something not like unfinished business in Europe. He didn't do too well at Atletico Madrid. He was over at Villarreal. When he came back to America, he realized that, he had potential. He went to River Plate and of course became the leading goal scorer under Marcelo Gallardo. So that's not, that's not saying, that says quite a great deal about what he's capable of doing. So if we look at it from that perspective, that is eventually what's going to happen. Now, let's switch gears. Brazil, Peru making their debut in Copa America. Of course, they, alongside Uruguay, the only two teams that have not played as of yet, but they play against Brazil. And yet again, this is the rematch of the final in 2019. Peru showed some promise. I really hope that Peru can make this match competitive. And based on, of course, we saw what they were capable of doing against Ecuador. And it's a team that needs to bring the intensity. And if they do, then they can give Brazil a hard time. They're one of the few teams that can give Brazil a hard time. I'm not saying beat them. I'm saying give them a hard time. Could they? Yeah, they could. Anything can happen in football. So let me be clear about that. But when you start looking at this Peruvian side, it's a very, it was funny. One colleague of mine, when we were doing the World Cup, he always said, Peru remind me of Minions. And he did, of course, he meant that in a way of which them working together, they're at their best. They being able to find ways to be able to make something happen only happens with the work of everyone and everyone putting in 100%. And it's a very collective team. You start to see players like Luis Advíncula, Renato Tapia, Josimar Yotun, those types of players that made a great difference against an Ecuador side that has started to struggle. And they were able to beat Ecuador at Ecuador, so in Quito. So that says a great deal about their personality, despite having all sorts of trouble during World Cup qualifying play, where, if you look at their recent record, Peru had struggled big time coming into that match. And there's talk about Peru not staying with Ricardo Gareca. If you look at it from that perspective, it was really difficult, because their last win coming into World Cup, coming into this Copa America, was a friendly back in 2019. It was back in, I want to say, like in September or so. Yeah, it was in September. In September of 2019. They beat Brazil. That was the last time they won prior to the game against Ecuador and Quito in World Cup qualifying play. They went 9 winless before winning again. So it shows that it's a team. And by the way, they were losing 2-0. They lost 3-0 to Colombia at home, a team that they hadn't beat in Lima in 40 plus years. So if you look at it from that perspective, the last time that Peru had allowed 1 goal was back in 2019. It was a friendly against Uruguay. So just so you have a bit of context as far as how the defense was. So there was never 1 goal scored in the Peruvian goal in a match for nearly 2 years. So that shows you what kind of struggles they had defensively, the rotations, the injuries, of course, all the other factors that had to be put into play. But that win against Ecuador might be changing, or might be turning the tide for Ricardo Gareca and his players. You start to see Gianluca Lapadula being able to emerge into a number 9 that takes away that dependency of a 37, almost 38-year-old Paulo Guerrero. So, you start seeing the Peruvian side, and it was like, wait, we can't score goals without Guerrero. And now, not only can you not score goals with Guerrero, he's the one that can also, I'm talking about Lapadula, being able to create those opportunities. So keep that in mind when you see Peru. But Peru, in order for them to be able to be competitive, each and every one of them have to play at the same level they played against Ecuador. They played a fantastic match against Ecuador. And that was what was able to bring them over the top. And they need to have that type of play in order for them to be able to compete. I'm not talking about win, I'm talking about compete. Now, if they win, even better, because it would make for a much more interesting Copa America. It would set up a template to, hey, how do we beat Brazil? I mean, there were interviews that were being given, and several players came out for Brazil. They were giving interviews prior to yesterday's practice, and they were just saying, hey, look, we're at a different level. We are at a different level compared to the rest of the teams in this tournament. They're not wrong, but as I've mentioned before, this is not one saying that Brazil's going to lose, that Brazil is not going to Brazil's not going to be able to win this tournament, or one trying to limit, or talk negative about Brazil. No. One is trying to find arguments for the other sides to be able to be competitive. And one of those aspects is a team that can drop back defensively and neutralize Brazil. Not necessarily beat them 1-0, but be able to neutralize them, make it 0-0, and go into penalties. And at that point, anything goes. So when you look at it from that perspective, that's where we start looking at Brazil, at possibly having one specific weakness. Can it happen? Absolutely. I mean, they've already seen it happen on home soil a couple of years ago. I mean, if you listen to previous episodes, I've already said, look, remember when Paraguay took Brazil to penalties in 2019? It can happen. I'm not saying it can't. I'm saying it can happen. But this is one of the few times where Brazil comes in this big of a favorite. And it's quite telling that Brazil is coming in with this much protagonism, and they're coming into their backyard, place where they've never lost. I mean, it's great to see, that Brazil is doing this good, because from a South American perspective, you're like, okay, fine, we at least have one team that can compete. We can have one team that's still considered a candidate to win it. Because if you look at it from a perspective right now, if Qatar were to start today, I don't think there's a South American team that would be able to compete. I can't say Argentina is a candidate to win it. I can't say Uruguay is a candidate. I can't say that maybe, the only one I can say is Brazil. Brazil's the only one that I can actually go and say, you know what? This is a team that I can truly depend on, that I can actually say, hey, you know what? They can actually become a very important player in this coming World Cup. So we will see how things play out. Wanted to kind of switch and divide this, because it's kind of a major swing from one end to the other, talking about what's going on the pitch to what's going on off the pitch. And the biggest news in the past few hours is, of course, the possible suspension of Marcelo Moreno Martins, the Bolivian striker, who came out on social media. I mean, basically, he put an image on social media saying that, thanks to all of you at CONMEBOL, this is all your fault. Thanks to you. I really appreciate it. And he brought up an interesting point, and we're still a bit sensitive to what occurred over in Euro 2020 with Christian Eriksen. And he brings up a question. He's like, what if one of us does die? And it's a topic that has been talked about quite a bit. I mean, he says, what if one of us does die? What's going to happen with you? We know that the only thing that matters to you is money, that the lives of players really don't mean anything to you. That comment is possibly going to lead it to a suspension for Marcelo Moreno Martins. Now, will they be as forgiving as when Leo Messi talked about them being thieves and being people that steal and are corrupt? I don't know about that. I think it's probably going to be worse. Because he is not Leo Messi. Leo Messi is a worldwide superstar, and of course, if he ends up saying something along those lines, people listen. But mind you, now because of the sensitivities that are going on, that are still quite prevalent in footballing, let's call it footballing society, with what happened with Christian Eriksen and how UEFA handled it, and the reactions from Peter Schmeichel and Kasper Schmeichel and the coach of the Danish national team, they're right. Is it something not feasible that these players are there's a lot of talk about certain things. There's a lot of talk about certain things within UEFA and CONMEBOL that haven't been done right and haven't been done in a way that is protecting the players or protecting the integrity of the game or integrity of the institutions that be. Let's be honest. It's okay to show a person dying on the pitch, but it's not okay to show a streaker. It's not okay for a player to show a sponsorship, an illegal sponsorship, as many call it, of a player showing, a sponsorship of whatever, of a person or a site or anything along those lines that's not being sponsored by the sporting entity. That's God forbid that happens. But a player dying, that's a different issue. Well, we've seen how UEFA is in terms of racism. It doesn't matter. It's very selective. It's very selective. In terms of the abuse that some players get, and the harm that it does incur upon the psyche and, of course, the safety of some of these players or the perceived safety of these players. So it's interesting to see, but also, I don't want to go off on a tangent here, but staying within the concept of health and these times still of COVID in many parts of the world, that regardless of what's been going on, it's still crazy to see that Brazil, the logic, it's still mind-boggling for people. And I've spoken to people like, why did Brazil get the Copa America? And you have to kind of explain, say, hey, you know what? Because they were the ones that believe that COVID, actually the president of Brazil is the one that believes that COVID still, a gripezinha, it's a little cold, it doesn't matter. It's a little flu. Who cares? So when you have 9 countries that are in a pandemic and there's restrictions all over the place, and you have one who is worse than all of them put together to a certain extent, and anything goes, well, fortunately, I guess to a certain extent, Brazil's governmental structure is very similar to for those of you in the United States would understand this a bit more. It's similar to the United States, where you have a federal government as well as state governments that have their own respective sovereignty. And obviously some of these state governors have decided, hey, you know what? No, I'm not doing this tournament in my state. I'm not doing this here. They've implemented their restrictions and their respective lockdowns based on their judgments. One's not here to talk about that, but one is also here to be able to give an understanding as to why certain stadiums are being used and certain stadiums aren't. So that aside, also keep in mind, and now imagine this, okay? You have a population, okay, let's do the math real quick. 200, okay, let's say 28 players times 10, that's 280. Let's double that as far as delegation is concerned. So 500, 600, let's say 800 people. Out of 800 people, give or take 50 or 100, however you say it, 52 as of yesterday were positive for COVID. And I'm talking about players, coaching staff, vendors, people that are offering services that are put into these respective bubbles within Copa America for the 10 teams that are participating. let's say 1,000, okay? Just to have a round number. 52 have come up positive. I know many areas where there's 10,000, 15,000, 20,000. Okay? Now, let's put it even this way. Your kid goes to a school where there's 1,000 students and 52 of them come up positive. You as a parent, how would you react? You as a student, and they tell you, hey, by the way, the place where you go to school, the place where you work, you have 1,000 people and 52 had COVID. How would you react? That's all I have to say about that. You might agree, you might disagree. That's fine. That's not a problem. But I'm just letting you know exactly what's going on in terms of what is going on inside of these respective bubbles. And bubbles, of course, very strict compared to what we've seen in World Cup qualifying play, especially with Venezuela. And even go further back when Uruguay had their outbreak. And players like Luis Suarez and Lucas Torreira and a bunch of others couldn't play because they were positive for COVID-19. So keep that in mind. This is why Marcelo Moreno Martins might get suspended. Because it's easy too. I mean, it's easy to suspend a player from Bolivia. It's easy. It's easy to use a Venezuelan as an example. Well, it is easy to use Venezuela as an example as well. It's easy to use a Bolivian as an example, a Bolivian national team player. It's easy to use a Venezuelan national team player as an example. It's not easy to use Leo Messi as an example. Although you can hold him out there and complicate things and have him stand a virtual trial, as he was in those recent, in those types of matches, in those types of situations, or in that particular situation. He said sorry. That's good enough. I'm not sure Marcelo Moreno Martins is going to go and say sorry. That's just my opinion. Because that's where this happens. But now, also, let's look at it from the other perspective. Why wasn't Marcelo Moreno Martins saying something before he turned up positive for COVID? Again, you see how things are with the players as well. It's this, it's okay until it happens to me. Now, if it happened to one of his teammates, if it happened to someone else, would he be singing the same tune? That's interesting to look at. Hey, would he? I'm not so sure. Again, that's part of this footballing fraternity, if you want to call it that. It's okay. Everything's okay until it happens to me. Always keep that in mind. Because if not, if these types of things would have occurred, then this group of players, the captains that were getting together and thinking about not playing the Copa America because of this and this and that, because of the way going and the backwards saying, we're against this Copa America, but we're never going to say no to the national team. So what kind of stand is that? You're playing under protest? I mean, I'd like to know what kind of pressure they're being put under. You don't play Copa America, you never will get called up for the national team. Yeah, you're going to say that to Neymar? And thus, lose your opportunity to win a World Cup? Because let's be honest. Let's say hypothetically Brazil end up not having these players available for the World Cup. Do you honestly think they have a chance? Come on, let's not be so naive. Let's not be so ingenious to think that everything was going to be okay if these players are gone. No problem. We can bring in a second or third team and we can be competitive. Maybe within Copa America. Maybe, if a Copa America and CONCACAF tournament is made, maybe, I don't know. But let's not kid ourselves. You think the CBF was going to go and just say, no, you'll never play for the national team ever again? There's hundreds of millions of dollars at stake for these board directors, these executives to go and say something as arrogant as that. It had to do more with let's call it what it is. Copa America is a propaganda tool for Jair Bolsonaro. And he knows it because electorally he's not the most popular person in Brazil right now. Because let's call it what it is, man. Let's call it exactly what it is. This is a propaganda piece for Jair Bolsonaro. He knows that he might lose the election in 2022. We know that Jair Bolsonaro might not be president much longer if things are going the way they are, especially the way he's handled, or botched, I guess you could say, the handling of this pandemic. Why not? You know, he had the opportunity to have something. And of course, football is always bread and circus, especially in a place like South America. What's the best thing you can do to relieve a crisis? Not in South America. It's not to start a war. It's to bring football and more football. It's hey, you know, let's put the World Cup rights on national television. Let's put the Argentine League or let's put the Brazilian League for everyone to see. Football is always that elixir to be able to save things in South America. And once again, we're seeing exactly why that is the preferred tool for many of diplomacy. Football. That's what it is. Let's not kid ourselves, folks. It's bread and circus to a certain extent. And I know it sounds like me talking out of both sides of my mouth because I'm covering this, or not covering this tournament. I'm at least giving information about this tournament, but at the same time, I can't be naive about it. I can't close my eyes to the other reality that is being faced by hundreds of millions of people in that part of the world.